Hi. Okay, today we're going to start talking through the Russell paper that you need to read. Okay, so this is, just to give you a bit of historical context, this is from 1905. The Frege paper that we read was from 1892, so this is a bit later. Um, Frege's work wasn't translated into English until quite a bit after this. Russell was familiar with it, though, and as you'll see him say in this paper, he's previously discussed Frege's ideas and sort of endorsed them. He's a fan of Frege's general approach, although they have some differences. Um, you will see him in this paper uh, disagreeing with, diverging from Frege's idea of sense as opposed to reference. I should say, I think the phrase denoting here that appears in Russell's title probably means about the same thing as referring or reference in Frege's work. Okay, so what I'm going to do in this video is go through sort of the broad strokes of what happens in Russell's paper. I'm not going to go into super great detail about the particular arguments because you can read those yourself. But I'm going to try and give you sort of a framework for reading the thing. And for those of you who haven't taken logic before, I'll talk through some of the logic-y things that arise here. Okay. So, something to notice at the beginning. So, I said I think denoting in Russell's vocabulary means something like Bedeutung, something like reference in Frege's vocabulary. But we should take this expression, denoting phrase, take that as a unit. So he says, by a denoting phrase, I mean a phrase such as any one of these: a man, some man, any man, every man, all men, the present king of England, the present king of France, the center of mass of the solar system at the first instant of the 20th century, the revolution of the earth round the sun, the revolution of the sun round the earth. Okay, a phrase is denoting solely in virtue of its form. What exactly do all of those things have in common? Maybe so those all look like the sort of things that in the Frege paper we were reading, Frege was calling proper names. Now, Russell is going to distinguish somewhat vaguely here, but more explicitly in other stuff that he writes in the sort of decade plus following this paper. He's going to distinguish between a proper name and descriptions. So all of the things here are kind of like descriptions, but at least none of them are proper names in like the grammatical sense. So Roger Clark, that's a proper name. Boris Johnson, that's a proper name. Maybe Venus is a proper name of that planet. But all of the things here aren't quite like that. So the present king of England, we might think of that as something like a description. What are we saying about that particular person? I guess there isn't such a person. Take the present queen of England. When Russell was writing this, there was a king of England. The present queen of England. I mean, she has a name. She maybe has a couple of proper names, Elizabeth II, or like Elizabeth, Victoria, Mary, something. She's got a string of first names that are her. Anyway, I don't really know how royal people's names work. But here's a description, right? So a fact about her, about that human being, is that at this time in 2020, she has the property of being the queen of a certain place. Which one? England. Okay. So this looks like a description. Maybe something like this. A man. Maybe that's also a description, right? I might use the phrase a man to tell you about, I see a man out there on the sidewalk. That's a description about that person. It's not a name of them. I'm picking out a couple of properties of that person, namely that that person is a man, that they're out on the sidewalk, on the pavement. Looks like he's watering his plants. Anyway, there are some other properties of that person. I haven't actually named him. Okay, just to give you some terminology I'm going to use going forward, and that we'll see in the later people we'll read. We can distinguish between definite and indefinite descriptions. Okay, a description is a phrase like all of these ones that Russell's called denoting phrases. They are not proper names. If they denote or refer to somebody, they do so by means of picking out certain properties that they have. Here's the difference between the definite ones and the indefinite ones. The definite ones start with the. Indefinite ones start with a or an. If you're familiar with these terms in sort of English grammar, these words the and a we call articles. The is the definite article, a or an is the indefinite article. That's the whole thing, the difference between definite descriptions and indefinite descriptions. Definite descriptions start with the other ones start with a. What about these other descriptions that start with something else, neither the nor a? We'll treat them differently. Those are neither definite nor indefinite descriptions, at least as I'll use those terms. Okay, so here we have, in our list of denoting phrases, we have an indefinite description, some other stuff. Here's a definite description. Here's another definite description, the present King of France. Here's another definite description, going down to that comma. Here's another definite description. It starts with the revolution of the Earth around the sun. Here's another one, starts with the. Those are definite descriptions. Okay. Russell's going to tell us some things about how to understand the logical structure of sentences involving denoting phrases. This is going to be different from the logical structure of sentences with proper names. For some of these cases, in particular for indefinite descriptions, Russell's account is going to be the same as Frege's. So some things that you saw in that Frege paper and in other things Frege's wrote, he tells you about how to understand the logical structure of certain sentences with indefinite descriptions. Russell's also going to tell you something about the logical structure of sentences with definite descriptions, and that's brand new with Russell. That's not following Frege. That's something else he's come up with. In fact, we have seen enough in the Frege we read to know that Frege disagrees, at least in some of these cases. But we'll get onto that. Okay. So, Russell says, here are the phrases I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about denoting phrases. Maybe there's a difference between denoting phrases that don't denote anything. So the present King of France, that doesn't denote, that doesn't refer to anything because there is no present King of France. This is like empty names, except here we're talking about empty definite descriptions rather than a proper name. Second possibility, a phrase may denote one definite object, like the present, let's say, Queen of England or the King of England in 1905, which denotes a certain human being. There's just one Queen of England right now. Or a phrase may denote ambiguously. So when I say a man, that denotes not many men, but an ambiguous man. That doesn't mean like somebody who might or might not be a man, but you know, if I say a man walked into the pharmacy yesterday. I haven't referred to a specific person. Maybe many people, many men even did that, and I'm kind of denoting each of them, sort of, kinda. That's a weird sentence. I should have picked a different one. I think this phrase, denoting ambiguously, is kind of awkward and confusing, and maybe he could have rephrased. I've heard it said that Russell was very proud of the fact that he never or very rarely needed to revise or edit his first draft of anything. This is probably a paper he could have edited a bit for clarity in places, but we'll see what we can do. I mean, I shouldn't question him. The man won a Nobel Prize in literature. He probably knows what he's doing. Anyway, okay. So, alright, this is our subject matter. This is hard. The interpretation of such phrases is a matter of considerable difficulty. It's hard to frame any theory not susceptible of formal refutation. But I'm going to give you a theory that I'm about to explain, which meets all the difficulties with which I'm acquainted. Okay. This next paragraph is a bit of background, or a bit of Russell telling you why he thinks these things are important, and we won't actually get into this stuff in this paper, but here's a reason why he cares about a difference between names and descriptions. He thinks, and he's going to articulate this over the next sort of decade plus, he thinks there's a very important difference between things that you know by acquaintance and things you know about only by description. So, in sort of the grand empiricist tradition, Russell thinks there's something special about direct sense experience of something. So I am directly acquainted with this cup. Maybe now you are too, depending on how you think cameras work. You maybe have a bit looser, less close of a connection to some other things you know about. I've told you about my brothers in other videos, brothers who are taller than me. I think I've told you about them. Maybe I only talked about them in my logic class. I have two brothers. They're both taller than I am. You now know something about them, right? At least if I'm telling the truth and you believe me and so on. You know that I have brothers, but you don't have any direct acquaintance with them. You haven't actually seen them. You haven't actually encountered them yourself. Likewise, you know something about, like, the center of mass of the planet Earth. There is such a place. If you wanted to get there, you'd probably sort of have to go down, generally. But you've never been there. That's kind of different. I don't think any of you have been there. I probably would have heard about it. Okay, so he thinks there's something importantly different in our knowledge of things by acquaintance and by description, and he thinks maybe the difference between proper names and definite descriptions gets at this. So if I know something by acquaintance, then maybe I can say things about it by means of a genuine proper name. Like, I'll actually have a name for the cup, but I can't do that sort of thing for the point of the center of mass of the Earth. I'm acquainted with my brothers. I know their names. You don't know their names. I haven't told you their names. Hopefully you haven't been, like, stalking me. Maybe you do know their names. That would be strange. Anyway, I think that's the kind of thing that's going on here. This is part of why Russell wants to mark a difference between proper names, which just sort of like directly refer to the object they refer to, versus definite descriptions, which sort of get it whatever thing they get at by means of some property, some partial, some fact about the thing that features in the description. Okay, that's what's going on in this paragraph. Maybe don't worry about it too much. Okay, here's an important one. Here's, the sort of thing we always tell you in your philosophy essays. It's a good idea in your introduction to say, here's what I'm going to do. Here's the thesis I'm going to argue for. He's told us I'm going to give you a theory of definite descriptions, and it's going to meet all the difficulties I'm aware of. Here's how the paper is going to go. The course of my argument will be as follows. I shall begin by stating the theory I intend to advocate. I shall then discuss rival theories, the theories of Frege and Meinong, showing why neither of them satisfies me. Then I shall give the grounds in favor of my theory, and finally I shall briefly indicate the philosophical consequences of my theory. Okay. That's what's going to happen. He's going to say, here's my theory, here are some other theories. he's going to have a bit of a direct argument for why Frege doesn't make sense. This is the Gray's elegy passage. I will mark it out for you. This is extremely hard to figure out, and I'm not going to hold you responsible for it. But the structure of the arguments that you are responsible for, that I think are intelligible and important, and I will ask you about on the exam, are of the form of problems. So he's going to say, here are some puzzles, some difficulties that these other theories run into, and here's how my theory solves those problems. So along the way, he'll tell you his theory, he'll tell you these other theories, he will tell you here are some problems for those theories. He'll go on a little side thing about Gray's elegy and why Frege's idea of sense doesn't work. And then he'll come back and say, here's how my theory solves those problems. So there's problems for the rivals, I solve the problems, so my theory is better. And then he'll say, here's my theory, it's important. Okay? That's the plan. Here's my theory briefly as follows. And here's where people who've taken logic before will be a little more comfortable reading this kind of expression. Let's start with this. I take the notion of the variable as fundamental. We've got to be able to grasp what's going on here. Let me come over to my whiteboard and tell you about how this works. Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to leave the word hello there. Okay. Forget about what's on Russell's page for a second. I'm going to explain what he's explaining in more detail. Take a sentence like, Russell was English. That's a sentence. Complete sentence. Tells you something about the world. It's either true or false. In fact, it's true as far as the structure of the thing. It doesn't matter if we had a true sentence or a false sentence here. Let's stick with the true one. Okay. If we're thinking about the logical structure of this thing, we might go through it and look for expressions that look like names or descriptions. So expressions that seem to refer to particular individuals. We've got three words here. We've got Russell. That, I think, is a name of that person that picks out, that refers to a certain person in history. Was English, that doesn't pick out a particular person. That seems like it attributes a property to Russell. Okay. I think we've talked a little bit about this with Frege. I'm going to go through it anyway. Okay, so we've identified here is something that looks like a name in the sense that it refers to a specific person. And now I can think, well, what happens to that sentence if I remove the name? So if I remove the name, that leaves a blank, right? I wind up with blank was English. And the way I get the original sentence is by taking the name Russell and plugging it into that blank, right? Okay. The basic idea of a variable, as Russell's talking about it, is it's a blank. Okay. So the way that we standardly write blanks like this in sort of logical notation is, with lowercase letters from the end of the alphabet, maybe sometimes put in italics. I don't seem to know how to put things in italics in this whiteboard app, but if I write X was English, that's supposed to say blank was English. And there's different ways of filling that blank in. I can put Russell's name in there. I can put my name in there. So Russell was English. That gets us a true sentence. Roger was English. That's a false sentence. I never was English. I'm still not. But there's a connection between those two sentences. One's true, one's false, but they're both attributing the same property to the person they're talking about. They're talking about different people. One's talking about Bertrand Russell, the other's talking about me. But they're saying the same thing about those two different people. And in logic, that kind of repetition, that kind of similarity of structure can be important. Okay. Just to give us symbols, will sometimes people like Russell will sometimes try to abbreviate sentences like this, right, that have a gap and then have some English words. We might write, say, just for a shorthand, I'm going to write C of X to stand for X was English. The idea is we use capital letters like this to stand for what we call predicates. So incomplete sentences like this one, blank was English, call that C. We mark in brackets how many blanks there are, right? So in this case, we just have one blank, X was English. We might think about other sentences where you'd wind up with more blanks. So if we started with, instead of Russell was English, we could say, here's a different sentence, Russell taught Wittgenstein. That's true. Pretty sure that's true. But now we have something that looks like it has two names in it. So if I take my earlier approach to figuring out the logical structure of this thing by starting with that complete sentence that can be true or false, finding all the names and taking them out, then I wind up with something that looks like this. Blank taught blank. Okay. And the two parts here that we have to stick in are the two names, Russell and Wittgenstein, right? So this one gets inserted in there. There we go. Okay. When you have a predicate, that is a gappy sentence that has multiple gaps, we sometimes need to be able to distinguish the two of them. There's an important difference between the sentence Russell taught Wittgenstein and the sentence Wittgenstein taught Russell, which is, I don't know, maybe true in a way. I mean, Russell, just as a matter of history, Russell actually was in charge of classes that Wittgenstein took. He was a tutor of his at Cambridge. I think that's true. Maybe Russell learned things from Wittgenstein. That's probably true, but he didn't take classes from him. Wittgenstein never supervised a dissertation of Russell's, whereas the reverse is true. At any rate, you can see that these two sentences say different things. Okay, the way we keep track of different gaps in a sentence is by using different variable letters. So I might say X taught Y. We used C before, let's use a different letter. Let's say D. We might write something like this to say DXY. That is short for X taught Y. Okay? That's the idea of a gappy sentence or a predicate. A variable is just something that tracks a gap where as far as the sentences, the predicates we're going to be looking at, gaps that track where you could put a name to get a sentence. Okay, Russell's going to say, and this is something that Frege had come up with, putting a name into a gap. That's one way to go from a gappy sentence to a complete sentence that is something that can be true or false, but it's not the only way. So I can go from, sorry, let me get back to where I was. So I can go from the sentence, or the gappy sentence, the predicate X was English. I can go from that to a sentence like Russell was English. So this is true. Russell was in fact English. This is neither true nor false, right? Because it's got a gap. It doesn't actually make any claim that you could go and check. It just says blank was English. This is something you can complete in different ways. Okay, here's a different thing I could say, a different way of completing that gappy sentence. I could say, oops, blank was English is always true. So this says, what I'm trying to say here is, no matter what name you put in that gap, you get a true sentence. In other words, well, no matter what name you put in here, you get blank was English is true. That's a way of saying everybody was English. Okay, that's false, but at least it says something. It says something that can be true or false, unlike the bare gappy thing, the incomplete thing, blank was English. Okay. And I can do things that are more complicated. There are other ways that I can, so instead of filling the gap by putting a name like Russell in there, I can describe what you can do to the gap to get a true sentence. So how about this? If I say X was English is not always true, that says, well, it's not always going to get you a true sentence to put a name in here. In other words, there are some names you could put in there that will make blank was English false. In other words, there are some people who were not English. Well, that's true. I can say blank was English is always false. So no matter what name you put in the gap, you get a false sentence. In other words, nobody was English. Well, that's false. I can say blank was English is not always false. So that says there's somebody you can put in some name you can put in the gap that gets you a true sentence. In other words, somebody was English. Well, that's true. Okay, that's the kind of thing we're going to exploit as we go through the Russell paper. So if I use C of X to mean a proposition, or rather a propositional function, don't worry about those terms, gappy sentence. Function, we're using this word like you might have seen it in maths class. So a function is something that like takes an input and gives you an output. So think of blank was English as like a function. So if you give it a name as input, it gives you a sentence as output. So if you feed it the name Russell, it gives you the sentence Russell was English. If you feed it the name Roger, it gives you back the sentence Roger was English. And this is something that in a regular way, whatever name you give it, it'll give you back a certain sentence, namely the one you get by putting the name in the gap. Okay, so this thing C of X we're thinking of as a propositional function. Proposition means something like sentence or what a sentence expresses. Later philosophers will be careful about the difference between propositions and sentences. Russell is not careful about it, and he thinks there's nothing important there. Okay. So take the notion of a variable as fundamental. I'll use an expression like C of X to mean a proposition where X is a constituent, where X, the variable, is essentially and wholly undetermined. So it's a blank, it's a gap. We don't know what you're going to fill in there. We can consider the two notions, C of X is always true, and C of X is sometimes true. Again, this is stuff he's taking from Frege's logic, which is the sort of thing that we teach you in a first-year logic class. We've just gone over that sort of thing. Now, look, here are a couple of denoting phrases that we already can say something about. So when I say C of everything, so in other words, take a sentence like everything was English, right? I've taken that gap, X, and I've replaced it with the word everything. So Russell thinks a sentence like C of everything, that is, a sentence that says something about everything, that means C of X is always true. Likewise, C of nothing means C of X is false is always true. Or we could just say C of X is always false. C of something means it's false that C of X is false is always true. Maybe I'm just going to say what I think would work better, and you can go back through and make sure that it says the same thing as this. C of something means it's not always false that C of X, or C of X is not always false. Okay. Okay. Let's skip a little bit. Okay, here's what we do with indefinite descriptions. If I say, I met a man, if this is true, there must be some definite man I met, but that's not what I've said. If I tell you I see a person out there, I haven't told you which one. I haven't said which one. If the thing is true, it's because of a specific person that I see, but doesn't mean, but the thing I've said doesn't refer to that person specifically. Rather, what it says is something like this: I met X, and X is human is not always false. So something to notice about how variables work. Here in this expression, we've got two gaps. I met blank and blank is human. But we've used not, so unlike in the case where we looked at that sentence, X taught Y, there we used two different variables. That means it's possible to fill in those gaps differently. But here, when I use the same letter both times, or when Russell uses the same letter, the same variable letter both times, that's telling you you can fill in the gap with whatever you want, any name you like, but you have to put the same name in both gaps. So here I'm saying I met Russell and Russell is human, or I met Roger and Roger is human. I met Josephine and Josephine is human. I know he says amen, but now it's human. It's 1905. Nobody really understands anything about gender. Not nobody. Russell. Whatever. Okay. So Russell thinks when you have an expression like I met a man, this means something like there is somebody, I don't know who is a man and whom I met. The way we can write that out is to say, here's this thing with a gap X, and that thing is not always false. In other words, there's someone whose name you can put into the gap to get a true sentence here. The thing with a gap in it is, I met X and X is human. Okay. We can get that much out of things Frege has said before. Let's get to, I'm going to skip a bit and go to the brand new thing. Here we go. For a definite description, so a description that starts with the definite article the, Russell thinks that thing says this. I'm not going to read this. I'm going to tell you what he's got in mind, and you can read this paragraph to see why he thinks it works this way. Okay. Russell thinks when you say, let me clear some of this out, when you say the father of Charles II was executed, that says three things. That means all three of these things are true. At least one person fathered Charles II. At most one person fathered Charles II. That person was executed. If you want to combine parts 1 and 2 into one thing, we will say exactly one person fathered Charles II, and that person was executed. That's what Russell thinks this sentence says. So let's do some abbreviating. So use our technique from before. Here's something that looks like a denoting phrase. If we take that out, then we wind up with blank was executed. Let's, instead of writing out a whole underline, remember we use variables for blanks, let's just write X was executed, and let's call that C of X. Actually, you know what, I'm going to call it E, because we've got C for Charles. Let's use E for executed. Here's what Russell thinks this sentence says. It says, let's put another thing in here. I'm going to use F of X to mean X fathered Charles II. Okay, so I've used something like a predicate here to say that somebody is a person who fathered Charles II. Okay, so the original sentence says, first of all, F of X is not always false. That's at least one person fathered Charles II. Second, if, let's say, person X and person Y both fathered Charles II, that's what F of whatever says, then they have to be the same person. This is a way of saying, this is an identity claim just like we saw in Frege. This is Russell's way of saying you can't have more than one person who fathered Charles II. If you've got some way you can fill in this blank, the blank X, to make X fathered Charles II true, and also another person. So since X and Y are different letters, that means you're allowed to put different names in those two places. But this sentence too says if you've got a way to fill in this name and a way to fill in this name so that f of x and f of y are both true, you must have put in two names of the same person. They're the same person. In other words, you can't have two different people who both fathered Charles II. Okay. 3. Okay, somehow I want to say that the person I was talking about in number 1 was executed. So I need to somehow say that guy was executed. Okay, so if I make all of this into one sentence, what I might say is, so instead of saying f of x is not always false, I can do this thing. I'm going to move that not always false outside. So I'm going to say, look at these three things together, f of x and, well, I'm going to keep talking about the same person x. If some person y fathered Charles II, then x equals y, and x was executed, I'm going to say the sentence 1 and 2 and 3 is not always false. That is, there's somebody you can put in that x gap that makes all three of these things true. That's how Russell thinks we can understand the father of Charles II was executed, a sentence about somebody with a definite description. Okay. This video is already really long. I'm going to stop here and we'll talk about the problems that he identifies for other views and how this theory solves them in another video. Yeah. Ask me any questions you like, but hopefully, particularly for those of you who haven't taken logic, this will be helpful. I particularly want to hear from you if you did or didn't take logic and this has not made things clear. If you have questions, ask me. Bye.